Hola, buenas noches. Hacía tiempo que no nos veíamos por aquí, pero me da mucho gusto estar de vuelta y quiero compartir con ustedes un texto que se publicó durante la pandemia, bueno, acabando la pandemia, pero el proyecto fue un proyecto editorial curado por Violeta, celis y me invitó a participar tanto escribiendo como traduciendo. Así es que voy a leer el texto, no lo he vuelto a leer, así que será una primera relectura después de la publicación, que fue hace ya varios años, 3 o 4, me parece, y es en inglés, así que de nuevo pido disculpas si mi pronunciación no es excelente. Empezamos. Cabe indicar que el proyecto constaba de un conjunto de cartas escritas por mujeres hacia otras mujeres o simplemente reflexiones en forma de misiva. Yo le escribí la carta dirigida a Violeta. Y empezamos. Each time my heart is broken, it makes me feel more adventurous, and how the same names keep recurring on that interminable list. But one of these days, there'll be nothing left with which to venture forth. My dearest V, after so many years of knowing each other and re-encountering ourselves within words, I realized something which I barely remembered myself. So I hope that while sharing it with you, the mnemonic synapses will go on reactivating those others which I foresee as if durmientes, yet expectant, laid down in an arid landscape into which they were crimped, the veins of an old railway that would never again be alive. Frank in structure, routes drawn over equidistant sequencing of robust wooden beams, accurately called durmientes, sleepers, hinged to the ground with the thick steel spikes and rails. Image among its narrative retreats, I hope to be able to intertwine the memories I shall rescue, configuring them as rafters to the remembrance in continuity of an apparently empty or emptied nothingness. The thing is, darling, that I need to retrieve parts of a story that isn't. Vacated by a really inexplicable desire, yet intensely intuited, so as to understand a configuration of a past so recent whose fate in depth emerges as if centuries old. To attempt it, I need to tell you about the stories and relationships that unstale me. During dark hours extracted from oblivion and its nocturnes. I'll start by telling you about one of the several meadows that unhinge this story, whose apparent reflexive tranquility penetrates me in an uncontainable assault. You may well know that écrire, writing, is the only book in which Marguerite Duras pondered about her profession as a writer. It always struck me the attention that Duras destined as a vital condition of existence, personal and professional, to live in her own house and write from its contained shelter. This happened for her as she was facing her midlife awakening, so to speak. That's when she bought her first and only house, the house at Nefaux-le-Château. Considering that the last time I read Écrire was several years ago, Duras pointed out as the most crucial, definite, and more relevant than any other condition to pursue an own house. Its foundational importance marked me invisibly yet indelibly. It wouldn't be by chance that in the House of Nefaux, her work condensed as a writing by shredding, whose lucidity devastates me time and again. The distances tensed within an almost untraceable sensitivity between passion and madness. Le ravissement de l'Olvestein, the ravishing of l'Olvestein, and Le Vice-Consul, the Vice-Consul, amongst her most shattering stories, were conceived and written at her own house, far from the concessions compelled when sharing a living space, the on-times, the love, the habits, the humors, and those obligated negotiations of a couple, which Duras engaged in at various apartments she had inhabited, all of them before Nefaux, before the house, her own house. You're probably already thinking, dear V, that among the durmientes on which I'm walking through these lyrics, it would be both impossible and mistaken not to quote A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf, because certainly both texts arise from a primal need to argue that in literary production the stance in consequence of possessing one's own space founded and confirmed to be the very possibility of creation for a writer. Each of them, of course, writing in, from, to its very particular cultural, historical context, as personal, intimate, yet both distressing the exact same nerve. Set apart from the noise, asphyxiation, and urban distractions, Duras seemed to have finally found both the existence of her space and her existence in space. Her dedication to writing allowed me to understand the exponential substance that nestles and isolates the traversing of that physical place where you struggle to be, as much as you let go, knowing that upon your return, the table, the writing machine, the whiskey, the cigars, the ashtray, and some first drafts riddled with corrections will all be there. Notations that cross back and forth the windows that oversee the garden. That was the happiest stage of her life, as a French writer said, while making that house hers, alone, her own house. The pathway to her own house began with an existence almost anchored to a small table, island, cornered somewhere inside a Parisian apartment shared with one or another lover. Then the tireless work transfigured that island into a displaced world, displaced from the residual spaces, from the time of the other disposed of hers. For, as I believe you understand me, it's not a matter of extending the tenure of ownership in regards to the dimensions of the scriptural space. What its occurrence implied, spatial and silent, was the encountering of and the belonging to herself. After surviving a raw crudity of a childhood shaken among the infamy of unbridled sadness and frustration of of the ruined mother, the vicious savagery of the older brother, and the tender, defenseless love of the younger brother. They grew prisoners, secured from in the family house, barely supported by leaves, as those durmientes of the old railroads initiated this letter. Dormant, awakened to the struggle year after year so as not to become undone by the violence of the monsoon and its floods brought by weather as by temperament. How far away was the sullen French Indo-Chinese girl from imagining the possibility of one day having her own house, when unrelentingly tons of hurtful nothingness exuded from the first home, that which supposes the familiar or at least maternal safeguard collapsed inside her, but whose enclaved purpose only responded to the prompt care of a plantation, as if imaginary, and its profits, never to be harvested from the sterile lands where the mother, incautious and scammed, had invested her lifelong savings. But as you must know, dear V, decades later, that girl, almost a teenager, with a lean body, seductive and seduced, who stared with curiosity at her already destroyed face, this is a quote from Lamont, since she was 15 and a half, would return to Paris. There she would study mathematics, law, and political science, and in time she would become an award-winning writer, playwright, and screenwriter since her first published book. A woman who in writing goes on doing, as can only occur when it happens within the time of writing, scarcely protecting herself as she went through her own story with such a simple and flat narrative. She made clear that it was life in its entirety, from where her writer being arose amidst each punctured letter. Therefore, I try to recover for you, eager to explain something about that unique, precise moment inhabited of tranquility, delight, and quietude that Durant described under the ceiling wooden beams, as if invisible writing lines that constitute her house. Desiring with words, drinking, smoking, and once and again remembering the wooden island, which was both anchor and seclusion, until she learned to transform the rest of her life into writing. Her reward would be rooted by conjugating a presence, as in the beginning, as in the end, the real motif that would enable to unleave herself at her own house, among gardens and silence, the presence of solitude. Perhaps she always sensed that when such an opportunity arose to buy one's own home, her only meaning and manner of existence would become, then and forever, undistinguishable. Ella en la escritura y la escritura en ella. Herself in writing and writing in herself. Alone. Alone. One as the other. Writer and writing. Maybe, dear V, you're wondering why I decided to share this synaptic remembrance with you, so without further ado, here is my answer. I find profoundly incisive to emphasize the conditioning condition of being alone to write, because unlike what's been presupposed, Dura affirmed that it was not being a writer what imposed solitude as a creative premise. Instead, she recognized as an urgency of vital need to surround herself amid the construct of walls of impenetrable disposition. Her way to conform herself amid the construct of walls of impenetrable disposition. Her way to conform a particular kind of solitude, one that would enable to on this close through space, which added to the indispensable untimeliness that allowed her to disappear. Imperative solitude to write. Imperative solitude to write, to disregard, to rewrite, to love, to remember, and to repudiate. Countless pages saturated with words whose existence pushed them closer to becoming a sort of foretaste of silence. The kind of silence that encircles a naked body, trembling as it settles itself on the next blank page. Confrontation almost muted by so much desire and an anxiety to empty oneself again into that dangerous and irresistibly seductive out space-time of words. Dura wrote without hideouts or qualms about that imperative solitude essential to be grasped and which she knew she would only find inside her own space. It was that being alone which she had borne all her life, but that before then she had not to rendered it to any place, until that first night when she locked the door from inside of her house in Nefol-le-Château. More than half a lifetime of incessant writing allowed her to give herself a house, so to inhabit its entirety with solitude. But don't think about any kind of solitude. Writing like hers required as an imminent condition a distressing and singular loneliness, one with which, during the course of her life, she understood as if destiny imposed by indisposition. Now, even though I know that you must have already linked certain relations and contours, you might ask, how does this relate to me? It happens that for more than 25 years now, without knowing the aforementioned essay written by Dura, I have been tracing detailed and impermeable outlines, searching for a very particular understanding about the conception of being saved, a sort of spiral understanding that departed from circumstances so blurred by remoteness as rootless in similarity between who I am inside writing and outside writing, alongside the correlations so far narrated regarding the conditions that Dura survived and forged in her writing. Since I realized that for many years I sought to build me into the precise environment pertaining to that kind of solitude, a solitude which I assume is a major occurrence, passé Derrida, that writing can condense, ideally materialize in the existence of an own house, inhabited and inhabitable only by me. Sometimes I feel like I've always known that. When the time came, I would need a place to safeguard myself in the solitude of the fundamental origin. So I rebuilt me within my family's architectural ruins of all past generations that surely and in various ways, even unknown, conform me. A confined house to inhabit an unconfinable writing. I never imagined seeing and living the worldwide unfolding of months in total or almost total physical isolation, attesting to the rapacity with which its marking becomes sayable by daily numbers and percentages given the death of one by thousands. In this way, through the curse of unfathomable weeks as if undatable that already have consumed this year, predict that one that follows and succumb in the mind, that I have been able to confirm the widespread incapacity by indisposition, personal, social, to confront and coexist with the depth of one's loneliness, the silence, grateful or cursed, and the saturated emptiness that exhales a dwelling inhabited by confined existences when forced to breathe in a space that has lost its exterior. To live the extension in continuous expansion of the emptying that supposes hearing the presence of the silence that conveys the loneliness, it doesn't matter if it comes on as a blow or if it has been conceived over the years. It's not a minor challenge, not even for me, being that I am and have summoned it for years. Before now, I knew that this would be one of the most demanding experiences I would have to face. And I say this with a broken back, a severely ruptured leg in its neurological continuum, plus 2 decades of incapacitating chronic neuropathic pain, which ironically gets much worse when I sit down to write. So, about the extendable scope of suffering, writing, loneliness, and remitted isolation, first inside a room, then in a house alone, I know that I'm dealing with, and I also know that there will be a how and a when where it will be impossible to continue doing so. So all that I've written to you in this letter, my dear V, anticipates a confession whose acknowledgement has been brutal for me. And that is that until now I fully realize that since my comeback to the individual solitude and the establishment of new relations with my own house, I had not been able to return to writing, at least not as I know how to, nor with the continuous overflowing passion and intensity that seduces me and from which my entire life wire walks from word to word. In fact, the re-emergence of my scriptural self happened rather recently, considering that for the past 35 years I have lived writing. Its occurrence took place over the last 7 weeks up until the day that marks this letter. With rigor, dedication, and discipline, I embraced the solitude and irreverence of time at my own house. so that I was able to give myself entirely to an extremely valuable and desired editorial project that first analytically, conceptually, book regarding a significant selection of artwork of the Brazilian artist Rubens Mano. An artist whose projects and processes I recognize as working through a conceptually and aesthetically of subtly profound magnitude, as if, again alongside Derrida, ungraspable, unpaired. But beyond that, when confronting his work, I vibrate from somewhere inside me in a way I didn't even know possible. Everything started during a curatorial selection at the end of the 90s when I met a single work of Mano, an urban intervention, and that was all it took. I was confronted by the image of an urban action so powerful in its way of establishing its critical political point, which, while at the same time configuring with equal force an extraordinary power of poetic experience. Back then, I had only access to a single photograph shot at night, a printed photographic record of the work. Mano's intervention took place at the core of the city of Sao Paulo, Brazil. Mano had created on a bridge viaducto of intense vehicular pedestrian traffic an unavoidable luminous intervention which touched each and anybody that crossed the urban passage. The title was already perturbing in and of itself, Detector de Ausencias. This was a work made in 1994. The rest, that is, since I learned about Detector, I followed Mano's career attentively, as if driven by a vital need. One afternoon, many years later, that took power, we were walking on the same bridge side by side, imagining I, remembering he. The two powerful beams of light extended over and inside the walking space of those Sao Paulo's inhabitants who had been there, exposed as a delicate, if during daytime, yet violent, blinding reminder if traversed by night. In the wake of this work, Detector de Ausencias by Rubens Mano, one of the most valuable experiences of my life came together. Not only because of the multiplicity of aesthetic artistic reflections as interludes that resound in his artwork and my writing, but by the foundation melting in me as a stance of consciousness traced over other horizon, very far from what I knew then and know now. An inflection in disposition over Mano's human quality and his responsibility as an artist, almost indistinguishable if found amidst the sands of contemporary art. Yet the importance, and there it was, about this bond within the extreme exigency and its not confessed enjoyment required by his job as a translation reviewer is that without warning it brought back my writer self. Little by little my habits came back, and with them I reconstructed my day-to-day activities. I regained a sense of solitude to stand up to my bodily damaged condition and transform it into writing. I returned to words with the same urgency with which they flooded me. This is why, my dear friend, I must tell you that within my singular existence, once returned to writing, thanks to Mano's entrustment and its transcendental importance, very little has changed in my daily routine, except when I recognize that bodily or corporeal untrust, social, singular, cultural, political, etc., that pandemic non-confinement has exploded. However, between the deep reconnection with my own house, it coincided that the same self-absorption that resurfaced in me the long for scriptural solitude and the unattended passage of time that completely detaches me from the world when I write. Those same 7 weeks of concentration and full immersion in Mano's project were, as well, the last 7 weeks my father would be alive. Yes, V, as you already know, my father died on a Sunday afternoon 7 weeks ago. With this fact so hollow, with this truth so empty, with this pain, I still don't know what to do, if there's anything to be done without. Anyhow, it is now. I have returned to writing after an extremely internal confrontation against a false, frank calmness which comes with failure. That's when and how I know that it is now that I'm facing confinement in its most atrocious and inconsolable form, paradoxically alien to COVID-19 and its own mortality. My father has died, and through the last 7 weeks of his life, I wasn't there. So I find myself, seemingly like so many other times, seated facing my table with my fingers wanting to dance again over the keyboard, but this time knowing that upon them, as upon me, has already fallen the indelible, fatal, irreversible mark, invisible for many, the mark that shatters all, and by destruction in dishonor clings inside the body when it knows that this is the first, last figure of solitude from which one cannot escape. I have considered naming it solitude by non-existence, so as to differentiate it from that solitude decided by selfishness and or out of passion for the profession, to displace it from that solitude from which I've written up until now. It is the mark of the no longer, of the inshareable, which has left us, emptied us, defeated by an abscess of time, which is now as forever fatal. And in that claim, as forever, is constricted inside the realm of the never again, which frozen boils unbearable. My father died. Writing came back to me. Remains The devastating task of undoing the temporal property of one of the two houses between which I've lived for the past 6 years. To leave the first one, which during our time was, as I can only see that now, an exercise for my home to be. It is time to leave it behind, now. To go to, this time indefinitely, to the place which has already been and will continue to be my true own house. At least I have the overwhelming certainty that I have learned to leave spaces turned into dwellings without further delay. I walk through the process of uninhabiting them without attempting to receive, even if one last time, the remains of a life that is no longer there. Writing, desolate the solitude of my own writing. This is my particular pandemic, dear Violeta, a pandemic from which I already sense, palpitating with a destabilizing certainty, that it will last as long as my existence persists, with or without cure in the world outside, and vice versa. The last unborderings of my confinement will be decided in their own time by words. Thank you, dear V, for the time you have summoned for from us between our own writing, our own life, and our own reading. From some resilient part of my heart to yours. M. Mexico City, August 12th, 2020. So, this is the end of the text, and this book was published with the title Meditations. It's a bilingual edition, Spanish and English, and it was an incredible project to have participated in. And I will be eternally grateful for the opportunity and the pushing that it entailed for me to keep on writing, even after the biggest loss of all. Thank you. Gracias y buenas noches.